Thank you.
All right, everybody's able to see that well?
Yes.
Yes, thanks, Phoebe.
Great.
Okay.
So I'm Donna Trujillo. I am the Vice President of Tiered Services and Special Populations at Generation Schools Network. I'm in my 6th year with the company. Prior to that, I was a teacher for pre-K through 12. I've been a director for special education for 16 districts in Colorado, not all at once, and not some 10 of them were at the same time through one position through our BOCES. And most recently, before joining GSN, I was the director of all 90 schools for the 3rd largest district in Colorado. I'm also an advocate for students with special and gifted needs. So thank you for joining us. And Steve, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Donna. And good afternoon or good evening, maybe for some of us. I'm Steve Martinez. I'm the area manager prevention services with Generation Schools Network. And I bring some of my experience and background is around public health and specifically youth prevention. And if we're looking at trauma through a prevention lens, then trauma is in fact a preventable occurrence, right? So I've spent a number of years working for local and state health departments, and also nonprofit entities doing community health and really looking to support communities in establishing best practices around prevention and trauma-informed care. I'm looking forward to our time today together. And I'm actually somewhat new to GSN, so I'll also kind of call that out. So this is also a really great learning opportunity for myself. Next slide, please. All right, so in our time together this afternoon, this is our agenda. We just had our welcome and warm up, but we'll be having an overview of trauma and ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. We'll also be spending some time talking and looking at neural development and strategies that may be associated with that. We'll also have time for Q&A. Just want to kind of frame this and call this out that, we're all here to do amazing work together. And really kind of highlight that there is hope and empowerment in all of this, right? Especially in life's challenges that I know we all face as kind of the human condition, and also the different types of supports that we can provide to individuals in our community as well. Next slide, please. All right, so just some kind of outcomes for today. We will be looking to or establishing a foundation of knowledge to understand the complexity of trauma. Number 2, why there may be negative outcomes associated with trauma and how to be trauma responsive. And number 4, how empowering education or SEL lessons tie into trauma-informed practices.
And also something I didn't say yet was, please feel free to jump in the chat or unmute yourself. This is informal. You can ask questions, share stories, provide feedback. We're all here to learn together, so please don't hesitate to jump in. And so during our session today, our time together, you may learn some things that will bring up past trauma. Please know that if that happens, feel free to message Steve or myself, and we can privately in the chat, and we can go into a breakout room with you, or we also understand if you need to take a break. And if you're not able to complete, we can definitely meet with you another time. And then you may learn some things that bring up feelings of guilt, anger, resentment, or helplessness. Remember, we can't control things from our past, but with knowledge and curiosity, we can prevent things for the future. And then with that, please set your intention of our time together to center around grace for yourself and others. And like I said a minute ago, do not be afraid to open up and share your thoughts and ideas as well. So, question for everyone. Does anyone have a breathing activity that they use or are familiar with? And if so, would you be willing to lead us through that? Steve?
Yeah, it sounded like somebody unmuted themselves. Maybe it caught some background. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I am happy to lead us through a breathing activity, Donna.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so let's how about for the next 3 minutes? Does that sound okay? And I can keep a timer on my phone over here. But what I want everybody to do is just take a second to find a comfortable position in your chair. If you are standing, if you kind of have a sit-stand desk, I would ask that maybe you find a nice comfortable position, or if you prefer, maybe it's the floor in your office, right? Kind of just kind of get relaxed here. We're gonna start in just a second. As soon as everybody has a comfortable position, make sure your feet are kind of flat on the floor. You can have your palms on your lap or off to your side. And you can either have your palms facing down on your lap or facing up towards the ceiling or the sky. Okay, so can everybody just close their eyes at this moment? All right. And I want everybody to just think a little bit about the day so far, from the time you've opened your eyes this morning to start your day, the small activities in between that. Maybe it's having breakfast, getting a workout in, taking the kids to school. I want us just to kind of reflect on the activities that have composed our day thus yet. Okay. So then we take a deep inhale in through the nose for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Out through the mouth. 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In through the nose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Out through the mouth. Deep exhale. Push it all out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Deep inhale out. In. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And deep exhale out. Out through the mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want you to focus on your breathing, the sound of your breath entering your lungs, and the sound of your breath as you exhale. As you're thinking about your day, I want us to start slowly letting our thoughts flow in, acknowledging that our thoughts are there, taking a second with those, and then letting those thoughts float away. Sort of like attaching them to a balloon and letting them float up into the sky. Inhale through the nose, 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Big exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And big exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hey, I want us to slowly start coming back to the present, back to our chair or our desk. Okay, I hope everybody had an opportunity to kind of reflect a little bit on the day and let some of the potentially negative energy that we may experience kind of float off. And now we're ready to learn and to be present. Thanks, Donna. You're muted, Donna.
I didn't want to bother everybody with my breathing. So one big statement is to remember that trauma is measured by the impact, not the event. So when we think about a car accident, we have the impact of the car accident. We may be cruising by it, right? And oh, that's horrible, hope they're okay. But for those people who are involved in the impact of that accident, there can be long-standing trauma or stress and things to do as a result of that impact. So just like trauma, the event can happen that causes impact, and then the resulting processes that stay with us for the rest of our lives create a greater impact. So as we're setting our minds into this work, we need to remember that it's not the event, but it's the impact. So adverse childhood experiences. We have abuse, which is physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect, physical or emotional. And then our household dysfunction. Could be an incarcerated relative, they may have been justice touched, mental illness. Another example is mother treated violently, substance abuse, divorce. Those are our categories when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. So there was a study done, an initial study done on this, and we can go ahead and bring that up. So the ACEs study was conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC in 1995 to 1997. And with this, it's so hard not to be the clicker, sorry guys. You're doing great, Phoebe. The study consisted of 17,500 plus, mostly white, mostly college educated, middle income, Kaiser HMO members from Southern California. And they were asked about how many childhood experiences, ACEs, did they experience from birth to 18? And what was found from that study is that there are negative outcomes of the ACEs. So we have our adverse childhood experiences, which then lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, often the adoption of health risk factors, we'll talk about those more in a bit, impacts on life potential, disease, disability, and social problems, including early death. And those with ACEs, and we'll talk about the numbers in a minute as well on this. However, it's been proven that having a significant number of ACEs leads to an early death and can decrease our lifespan by 25 years. So with that, the next discussion is for all of you to have in the chat or by unmuting. So what I shared about that study, what questions are left from what you just heard, and what doesn't this study tell us? I'm going to pause for a minute so everybody can either unmute or drop in the chat your thoughts on these two questions based upon what I just shared. Think about the study, think about what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us, and what questions we still have left. Steve, thoughts on this?
Yes, definitely. Thanks. You probably saw the wheels turning. I'm curious about the sample or the population in which the study itself was conducted with. Is that conclusive in terms of being descriptive of all races and ethnicities?
Okay, and then Chanel agrees with you, the numbers for the impact on marginalized people. And then we have what are the positive supports and of the population studied. So we can keep going, Phoebe. Those are common questions we get from that. What I can tell you is that even though we do not have, it was a very specific population, the data and research since then, which we know there has been a lot more, still is in line with that small subpopulation. So it established that it doesn't matter if the race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, community that you're in, you're impacted, the negative impacts from those ACEs are across all humans. So that we bring that up just to remember also when we're looking at data, we need to make sure that it is a broad population. And even if it's not a broad population, look at other data to affirm if that data is aligned. And in this case, it actually was, which is pretty surprising. So we tend to have three realms of ACEs. Oh, you can go back, Phoebe. So in the three realms, we have our household, our community, and our environment. So household can include bullying, which we have in schools, the parental mental illness, that kind of factors that we see often students talking about or that surface up. And then a lot of times we forget about community and taking a deeper dive into that, such as poverty, lack of jobs, lack of resources, access to our infrastructure, and then the environment, weather, climate crises, tornadoes, as you see there, wildfire and droughts, natural disasters, hurricanes. I know those of you in Florida are familiar with that, earthquakes. But the one thing that is now important to remember is that every child that's currently school aged has experienced one ACE, and that is the pandemic. And even ourselves as adults walked through that pandemic. So there's no one who was living within this world at the time of the pandemic who's currently in school or serving students in school who have not experienced one big ACE.
That's a great point, Donna. I want to add a little extra context to kind of the community level in terms of ACEs. So that root system is really describing the social determinants of health, right? And social determinants of health are really those things that are necessary for individuals to be able to thrive in a given environment, a community. In this instance, our basic needs being met, right? Those are big indicators of individuals' health status and positive outcomes, right? The interesting thing about systems is that in any city across America, social determinants of health exist and are real, right? Certain populations, more marginalized folks, unfortunately experience these at higher rates. And so when we add that to other types of ACEs in the household, more at the individual level or environment, right? That those larger things, we're talking some high ACE scores potentially for certain individuals in certain communities.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't even have to have a student share that with you. If you take a moment, step back and look around you and the community that you're serving, you can already call out if a student is experiencing or has experienced ACEs. Thank you, Steve. Great point. Okay, so then we have our framing for the discussion. So there are 4 R's of trauma-informed care that we want to follow and practice. So the first is realize. We want to realize the widespread impact and the potential paths for recovery. I know that there was a question there, what were the positive supports for the population studied? Well, part of that, thank you for sharing that, by the way, is understanding the potential paths. Next step is to recognize what are the signs and symptoms of trauma and what are the triggers, right? So how we respond when someone is traumatized or has a traumatic event that has impacted them, how we respond, not react. So we want to fully integrate our knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices. A lot of times we'll have staff attend these and they're like, well, I'm not part of the policy and decision-making process. So what can I do about it? Well, within your own person, within your own classroom, you can be trauma-informed and you can develop and implement systems and practices that help you with responding. Now, we're not saying it's all on you. It's also knowing when you reach your potential to call in support too. And then resisting re-traumatization, that is as important as any of these other steps. And again, recognizing, responding, and then resisting those re-triggers. And just so you guys know, for our presentation today, we're going to be giving an overview of trauma. And then in our part 2 for January, you'll be getting more information on exactly what to do. Oh, yep. And then Chanel said she just participated in another training where they highlighted the 6 R's in working with grief and trauma. Yep. And there are different levels and different supports. We're highlighting the 4 R's for our training today. Thank you for sharing that. So we have to first realize the widespread impact. So think about these numbers. 61% of adults had at least one ACE. Well, if we look at COVID, we now know that 100% of adults who were in that 16 to 18 category during COVID now have an ACE. And 16% had 4 or more ACEs. So females and several racial ethnic groups are at greater risk for experiencing 4 or more ACEs. I, though, have seen an increase in ACEs in males as well through my research and work with others. And many people don't realize that exposure to ACEs is associated with the risk for health problems. So if we have 44% of our adults, we could, with depression, that number could be reduced if we work to prevent ACEs. So for our children going into adulthood, we can decrease depression by prevention and supporting them in not further being exposed to the ACEs. And 5 of 10 of the top leading causes of death are associated with ACEs. So let's take a look at that. So here are some attributable risks and the percentages with the ACEs. You can see the current depression, disability days, alcoholism, life dissatisfaction, promiscuity, suicide attempts. All of this is impacted and are attributable, I can't say that word today, to ACEs. And then what happens if we do something about it? So if we can reduce ACEs, we also see a simultaneous decrease in all the conditions I just shared. So you can see, can you go back to that previous slide just so we can compare? You can see there how broad it is, but then you go to the next slide, and with prevention-based practices, how those all areas shrink. Okay? So for our students, here's some information. Students with 3 or more ACEs are 2.5 more times likely to fail a grade, score lower on standardized tests, have language disabilities, receive disciplinary consequences such as suspension or expulsion, and are designated as special education more frequently and have poorer health. When I first started as a director eons ago, our state level students with IEPs for all of Colorado was around 8%. Now all of Colorado is hovering a little above 12% for students identified with disabilities. So as population grows, but also as trauma and events occur, we're seeing an increase in students needing support and being identified with disabilities, because like we said earlier, that's part of what can result in that neurodevelopment. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So if we're looking at a classroom of 30 students, this is just another visual for you. If you have 30 students in your classroom, you're only going to have 6 students with no ACEs. Now you're going to have everybody with at least 1 because of COVID. 5 students with 1 ACE, 6 students with 2 ACEs, 3 students with 3 ACEs, 7 with 4 or 5, and 3 students with 6 or more. So let's look, 2/3 of your classroom has 3 or more ACEs. That's pretty mind-blowing. And that's where we are working to train ourselves with knowledge and prevention, and also be able to resist that re-traumatization. And what works for some works for all. Remember that too. So early trauma and stress, that creates predictable patterns of brain development, traits, and behaviors. So this can lead to a diminished IQ, memory problems, slowed language and reading. That's where you see a lot of specific learning disabilities. Social, emotionally, the attention problems, ADD, ADHD, behavior, social isolation, misunderstanding or misinterpretation, or not even recognizing social cues. And all of that leads to the high risk of early substance abuse and use. And then as a result, we see special education, failure, or dropout, and then increase in suspension, expulsion, truancy, and also the school to prison pipeline. Then when they become an adult, there's that intergenerational risk of low wage jobs, unemployment, public assistance, chronic health problems, mental health problems, substance abuse problems. So it's a full continuum that occurs when we have 3 or more ACEs. And then since we're talking about mindset, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I want you to count as many squares that you can count in this picture, and then drop your number into the chat when I say time is up. So let me get my timer up, and I will have you start counting. Sorry, just a sec. I'm gonna have you start counting right now. Go ahead. All right, how many did you get? Our timer's done. How many squares did you see? I see some 34, 39, 33, 34. Anybody else? 31, 39. All right, guess what? Nobody's right. Because the lesson in this activity is not about the number, but it's about understanding that if we sit with a problem, the longer that we sit with a problem, the more we'll see. So if I would have given you 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes to look at this, you would have found way more squares. So it's just like that with our students, with those we work with and those who we connect with. We can't take things at face value. Sometimes things take time, and sitting with ideas, digging deeper, can always cause us to see and help us to see more squares in the picture. And so that's enough of the data. What we know is that what's predictable is preventable. And I'm going to pause just a second because CJ, do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Phoebe had to leave, so CJ took over.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm CJ Roberts. I'm the Director of Empowering Education. That's our SEL curriculum. And I'm going to step in and help out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome. And so next slide, what's predictable is preventable. How do we prevent this? Oh, is it not advancing, CJ? Okay, there we go. Recognizing the signs, that's first. So what are some signs? We talked about this earlier as an important part of this work. First, we might see a student who has increased difficulty making friends or maintaining a relationship. They may be becoming socially isolated. Another sign is the reducing of ability to respond, learn, critically think, kind of problem solve on their own. I often see kids then relying upon the adult when before they may have been independent. If they're coming to you for more help than they were previously, that's a sign to dig deeper. Is it the curriculum? Is it beyond their ability? Or is it because they're struggling and triggered in some other way? And then that lower tolerance for stress, we might see them fighting, behavioral outbursts, checking out, eloping, or simply being defiant and refusing. And then increased problems with learning and memory, which can be permanent. The increased stress hormones, which affects the ability to fight infection. So I know I even watch as a parent with my own children. If I see them getting sick often or like back to back, I take a step back and I talk to them. Are you doing okay in school? Do you need help? Are you feeling overwhelmed by anything? And it's a good check, right? Is there anything that's causing that immune system to be weakened? Or is it simply just they caught a virus? It's always good to keep that in mind, not saying you have to be overly sensitive, but it is something to be aware of. And then what we also know is that toxic stress increases the heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing, which can cause those long-lasting health problems. So if you see a student who's getting red, or it's okay, you can stay on this one, getting red or breathing, that could be a sign that they're also triggered. Go ahead, CJ. So how do we recognize the triggers? Let's see. So when we don't understand a behavior, we tend to assume a child is doing it on purpose. So when we move to our growth mindset, shifting our mindset, we then see that some common trauma triggers. So that unpredictability of routine or a sudden change, students can feel a loss of control. They may have feelings of vulnerability or rejection. It can also come out as confrontation with authority or limit setting, or that can cause them to be triggered. Sensory overload. A lot of times our classrooms have so much visual and auditory input that can overwhelm a student, and we have to take a step back and pause for a minute. Is what anything in the environment causing sensory overload? Is it my instruction? Another way to look and avoid triggers. A sense of loneliness, and then situations perceived as unfair or unjust. So it's always important. I was in a sexual violence prevention meeting earlier, and we were talking about building a survey for students. And we talked about the importance of explaining why a question is being asked to avoid that situation being perceived or that question being perceived as unfair or unjust. Also, if students know why they're doing something, it helps them to feel more comfortable and know to ask for help if they need it. So what do we do next? We have to think about the fact, go ahead, CJ, that behavior is communication. So we get our triggered responses. We have fight, flight, freeze, or submit. I so often when I'm doing these trainings have people say, oh, fight or flight, but forget about freeze, or they get fight, flight, freeze, and forget about submit. All four of these are common trigger responses that we need to watch for. And I want to take a minute to talk about that submit. So they may be withdrawing, not engaging, aligning with other peers that are more powerful, who can kind of, even if they're mean to them because it's a shield, right? I don't have to be seen. Giving in too easily, you tell them to do something, it's like, okay, whatever, or someone else. And not taking care of their personal needs, refusing food, not eating, not taking a break when offered. Those are all part of submit too. So what do we do next? So we're going to talk through our empowering ed lesson. Part of this is understanding ourselves. And you can use this with your students, but we're going to take a moment and do this together now. It's our self-compassion inventory. Go ahead, CJ. You can keep going to the next slide. So I need you to grab a piece of paper somewhere to take notes and be able to jot down. What I'm going to do is read each of these questions. I'm not going to give you a lot of time to think about them. I want you to then just write with the first number that comes to your head into your brain. And you're not going to be sharing your final number with others unless you decide you want to. So we're going to rate this first slide on 1 being almost never, 5 being almost always. So first question, I try to be understanding and patient towards those aspects of my personality I don't like. When something painful happens, I try to take a balanced view of the situation. I try to see my failings as part of the human condition. When I'm going through a very hard time, I give myself the caring and tenderness I need. When something upsets me, I try to keep my emotions in balance. When I feel inadequate in some way, I try to remind myself that feelings of inadequacy are shared by most people. Next slide. Now we're going to reverse our ratings. So 1 is almost always, 5 is almost never. When I fail at something important to me, I become consumed by feelings of inadequacy. When I'm feeling down, I tend to feel like most other people are probably happier than I am. When I fail at something that's important to me, I tend to feel alone in my failure. When I'm feeling down, I tend to obsess and fixate on everything that's wrong. I'm disapproving and judgmental about my own flaws and inadequacies. I'm tolerant and impatient toward those aspects of my personality I don't like. All right, so how do we total this up? Go ahead, CJ, to the next one. So what I want you to do is total all 12 numbers that you have. And then you're going to divide that number by 12. I'll give you a minute to do that. All right. Does anybody need more time? Okay, so you can interpret your overall score according to this rough guide. So if you have a score of 1 to 2.5 for your overall compassion, that indicates that you may be low in self-compassion. 2.5 to 3.5 indicates you are moderate, and 3.5 to 5.0 means you are high. Okay, CJ, next. So you guys have the PowerPoint. I'm not going to read through all of these, but when you go back and you want to look at the questions, it shows you here what the questions are teasing out. So 1, 4, 11, and 12 are self-kindness versus self-judgment. And it tells you what you can do when to adjust those numbers and for yourself to strengthen in that area if you're lower in those areas. And then 3, 6, 8, and 9 are common humanity versus isolation. Next. And then mindfulness versus over identification for 2, 5, 7, and 10. All right. So we're going to give you a moment. There are, let's see, how many do we have today? We're going to do a 5-minute breakout room we want you to talk about what you've learned and how this may help you with your working with your students. So CJ is going to put you into breakout rooms. Give her a minute.
I'm almost there. Okay, are you ready for me to open them?
Yes.
Okay.
And we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Are the three that have gone all in the same room, CJ?
Yeah, it looks like Andrea, Emily, and Gloria have not.
Okay.
They might not be able to go just wherever they are.
Yeah, can we make sure that the breakout rooms do have somebody in, that nobody's alone?
Nobody should be alone. There's at least 3 in each.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
That's correct.
Okay, good.
Okay, let's see.
Did you set the timer for the breakout rooms, CJ?
I don't know if I said it correctly.
That's okay. I'm watching on my phone.
Okay. It's like every time I do it, I get worried that I'm not doing it right.
That's okay. We have a quiet group today.
Yeah.
Hi, Chanel. Did you get kicked out?
No, my teammate, there were 2 people in my room. One couldn't talk and the other one was the test person. So I didn't have
Oh,
anybody
okay.
to talk to.
Oh,
So
I see
figured,
that. Okay,
just come
so
back.
Well, talk to us.
we can move Erin and Chanel into another room if that would be, if you'd
Or
like
just
to do
put her
that.
Oh
into
no,
the
just
room.
Erin was the person who couldn't talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there was a test prep person and then Erin, and so I was like, well, I'll just come back.
All right. Well, what have you learned today, Chanel, so far? I know you saw, it looks like you've been going to other trainings. Is there anything that you want to share or talk about?
I mean, I'm really grateful that the information about the ACEs studies is getting more shared, right?
Mhm.
Definitely. I think it's fascinating that it's been like over 20 years at this point, right? That survey came out and that they're
Right.
just now kind of still like trying to dig into the people that actually really kind of we need to support and look
Mhm.
at resources for, right? I think it's pretty fascinating at that in those pieces. But I'm glad it's getting shared with multiple like factions of our communities, right? So I'm a counselor at a school district, but I know it's being shared in with teachers, obviously, and like after school programs and like admin. So it's really, I think especially on the back end of COVID, it's really imperative that we talk about these things because, I always hear those little chirps of people who say, their kids never came back from COVID, right? They were like one kid at one point and then they went to COVID and everything shifted and now their kid is not the same kid. And of course kids grow, right? Kids develop and things, but at the same time, it's a culture of things that we're hearing. So I think it's important that we study the patterns for sure.
Yeah, and I love what you said too, because it's becoming more of a shared common language versus this hidden language. And I was raised, you stuff down your emotions and you keep plugging forward when maybe that's not that we know that that's not the healthiest approach. And so really having the open discussions to be able to feel more open and not afraid to talk about the difficult matters. And like even with my own brother, he still has this mindset that mental health is some like weird, guru trying to change your brain and give you ideas that you don't need to have in your mind. But there's still that like mindset, right? But the more we talk about it, the more we share and the more we learn, the more open we can be with each other.
Yeah. And that second half, just like you were saying, right? It's not about us making suggestions of what to do.
Mhm.
We explore what you need. You're the expert in your life, and we're along for the ride in case you have a question or, want to know about something else that's not maybe right in your purview, right? Like that's
Right.
why we come along for the ride as professionals.
And this might not be a fit for you, but maybe here's something that could.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And
That
it's
voice
not
and
it's not a
choice.
bad thing to ask those questions or to inform yourself, right? Because even if
Nope.
I'm not your expert, you're getting knowledge that's going to help you in those next places that you're going.
Exactly. Yep. CJ, we can bring the rest back. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love the ability, that voice and choice you brought up. It's important.
Everybody has 60 seconds, Donna, just so you know.
Okay, no worries.
Do we have any more breakout rooms?
No, I don't
Okay.
think so. Wait,
No, that's it
that's it.
for today. Yeah,
Yeah,
Okay.
today's session.
because we're doing other activities.
Oh, and sorry, just because we're all here.
Yeah,
How long? When does this meeting end?
at 5:30.
5:30. Thank you.
Yeah, yep. We may be done earlier. We'll see.
Wait, and you mean 5:30 your time? 5:30.
Yeah,
I'm in the.
5:30. 5:30
Oh.
Mountain Standard Time.
There you go.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So that'll probably be an hour before for me because I'm on Pacific. So
Yes.
4:30.
Yes, 4:30 your
Okay.
time. Yep.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. So Chanel, Steve, CJ, and I got to have a discussion. For those of you in the other breakout rooms, can we take a moment and have somebody share your discussion or thoughts or ideas? Or you can type them in the chat too, whatever you prefer.
I'll share. I just shared about myself. Like I know I'm 50, so I know where I'm gonna falter. I know, even through therapy, pretty intense for the last 4 years, like I still know, where I was gonna fall on that. And it doesn't really impact my teaching because with other people and especially with young people, I give so much empathy. I have so much empathy for pretty much anybody except myself.
Right.
Yeah. So like it doesn't impact, like I know these things about myself. I try to rationalize, rational part of my brain says everybody struggles, everybody make mistakes. But then I just ruminate and ruminate and ruminate about whatever little thing I did wrong or big thing I did wrong.
Or how could I have done better? Or what didn't I do? Right. So it's
Absolutely.
that compassion for self. And you know what, Amy, you're not alone, because that's part of the heart of being an educator. A lot of us chose our position in education or being involved because we have that empathy and we want to support others. And as a result, we give up a portion of ourselves. So Steve and I were actually talking before we started today about the work-life balance. Steve, you want to share a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So kind of just in my own experience, and Donna and I were having this conversation around, work-life balance and what does that truly mean in today's society, right? And it's probably a little bit different for each individual, but the expectations of the professional world, the speed at which we can communicate and talk to each other is great, but when we're thinking about kind of emails and communications, it sets us up for this kind of like constant work stream workflows, right? Am I paused or can you all see
We
me?
can hear you. We can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay. And so, and just really thinking about, how do we take the time to step back and kind of prioritize, that work-life balance and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. And, and Don and I were just sharing a few kind of techniques that we use to kind of help, create that space. And I think this is really important because all of us here today, in some aspect, we're providers, we're educators, we're nurturers, right, by nature. And I think this is also, we're talking prevention, this also helps us to kind of combat compassion fatigue, right? Which we know, especially in a post-COVID-19 environment, compassion fatigue is real. That's not just for healthcare providers. That's, I think, for any individual who experienced what COVID-19 was, right? And for us as kind of folks who take care of other people and really try to help, right? We just need to make sure that we're creating that work-life balance for ourselves, right? And that self-compassion and that self-care is so necessary.
Yeah, I met with the Colorado Department of Education last Monday, and we talked about the teacher self-care, right? You guys, like, people have hounded this into all of us. You need to take care of yourself and you need to take care of yourself. What came out of that conversation with them was something really cool for me and got me to think, so I'll give it to you guys too. Rather than our personal self-care, we can look at it through the lens of community care for our community. And then opening it up through that lens allows us to say, I have this whole community of support around me, and how can we build our community, or what can I do for my community, versus just putting it on yourself. And I loved when that comment was made to me. We're all exhausted by hearing, oh, you got to take care of yourself. You got to take care of yourself. Well, I know that, but let's take care of each other. And that if we can approach it through that lens, that might help us get that next bump up. Anybody else have anything to share? All right, CJ, we can move on. And again, as you had thoughts, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We love the interaction. It makes us not feel like we're talking to a wall, guys. All right. So we talked a little bit about the impact of trauma on the brain. Let's dig deeper. So we have our basic structure of our brain. As our brains are developing, the brain stem develops first, and that is our instinctual or survival brain. And then as we grow and develop, if we're in a healthy environment, our limbic brain comes next, and that's our emotional or feeling brain. And trauma, again, can impact this, and we'll talk about that more. But then we have our final formation in our brain and development in our brain are the neural pathways for that neocortex. That's our rational or thinking brain. Now, one important thing to note is that the limbic and neocortex need to be taught. It's not something that's automatically developed or learned, but it's something that we need to spend time teaching our students. And there are different developmental stages and ways to scaffold that instruction. And when our brain experiences a high level of trauma, our brain development occurs in a different way. So you want to go to that next slide? So with our brain architecture, again, like I said, they're not just born, but they're also made. So our early life experiences and knowledge play a major role. We've also seen the effects when those experiences are traumatizing, and they're not positive effects, obviously. But if we, through that growth mindset lens, we think about a brain needs nourishment, just like we nourish our bodies. We have to develop that in our students and those we work with. And so what does a brain who's experienced trauma look like versus a typically developing brain? The next slide will show us that. So when we have a typical development, you can see this triangle, the upside down triangle. Our brainstem, our survival part, is much smaller. And then as we continue to develop, we come to the regulation, and social emotional, which is that limbic, the midbrain, and then eventually into our cognition, which is also the place in our brain that controls our executive functioning, that planning, organizing, task initiation. Now, for a brain that's experienced developmental trauma, that triangle is reversed. So students who have experienced a lot of trauma, our children that have, their brain spends a lot more time developing the brain stem. So I like to look at this as my shoulders, right? If I have experienced a lot of trauma, my brain stem expands all the way to my shoulders. And then going up, my limbic system and my neocortex are smaller. So when a student is triggered by trauma, the automatic bam go-to is that survival brain, because it's as broad as my shoulders. So the other parts of our brain never get a chance to even kick in, or as the firing of the neurons just leads us straight to survival, fight, flight, freeze, or submit. And that's an automatic trigger that occurs. So we have to think of our students who have experienced trauma or a high number of ACEs through that lens of the brain. Where is the most brain power going to be spent? In the state of crisis, and that's going to be the survival part of our brain. Okay, so just like we know with the Leaning Tower of Pisa, sometimes we think we have a strong foundation and we've built it correctly and there's nothing that can go wrong, but that foundation can be weak or could have been built on a weak foundation from the get-go. And so it's far more difficult when you have to go back and fix things rather than doing things from the beginning, which is a lot of what Steve and my work is in that prevention and providing the supports from the beginning or as early as we are able to do to prevent ongoing trauma and even re-triggering. And so we're going to jump into another empowering education lesson. And these are all lessons we're doing with you, but you can use them with your students too. So we're going to do a graphic organizer, and we're not going to jump into any breakout rooms to do this. I just want to take a moment and reflect. If you could drop your thoughts in the chat, that would be most helpful, or feel free to unmute. What are a few facts that you've learned so far? Why is this useful for you to know? And why is it useful for the people around you? I'm watching the chat. Steve, did you have any learning or thoughts?
Yes, I definitely did. This is useful, for me. This helps me to understand, interactions and behaviors of individuals that we come across every day, right? Whether that's in the classroom or that's in the office, at the grocery store, in traffic, right? This helps me to kind of get a better understanding of why potentially somebody may be behaving in a certain way, right?
Mhm.
This kind of gives me an understanding that, I think oftentimes, especially with adolescents, we tend to think it's willful disobedience, right? When in fact it's not, right? There's some deeper underlying things there. And I think when we're kind of looking at it through that lens, that also gives us, we're more open to solution-oriented ideas, right? How can I best support this student, right? And it kind of takes that personal piece out of this, right? It's not because student A, little Steve doesn't like me, there's some things going on and let's figure out what those things are. And that's kind of my takeaway from this and really this kind of trauma-informed practices. And I'm hoping that all of you can kind of resonate with some of those feelings as well, right? How do we get to a place where we can truly understand what may be driving certain behaviors, right?
Right. And also, like, behavior is communication. I always keep that in my mind. It's like my mantra to my brain, like, behavior is communication. So what is this behavior communicating? And then I go back to even just the square activity and say, oh, what do I need to learn more about? What can I gather? And Amy, thank you for sharing that you learned about the ACE study, and that the research is still valid, even though the diversity was not as expansive in that study. And Chanel, the ACEs are prevalent and being looked at more post-COVID, definitely having that empathy for self and others, and the great background for context and understanding of the brain chemistry. Yeah, and that neurodevelopment piece is also, Chanel, I know when you were talking with Steve and I and everybody was in breakout rooms, we talked about the development and how this is becoming more socially acceptable, I guess, to talk about. And as we learn more and keep digging more and it becomes more of a common shared language, that can help us all in supporting not just ourselves, but others. And so this activity is a great way to kind of diversify your instruction with students. And even if they can't share, it's a check for understanding as well. A simple activity can go a long way and start the discussion. And then, yeah, we can help break those negative cycles and prevent the misinterpretations of people's behaviors by having this knowledge. Knowledge is power, and knowledge is the one thing no one can ever take away from you. Okay, so we want to resist re-traumatization. So we need to do this by understanding there are different types of stress, understanding the person's response to stress, and understanding what stress tolerance is. So let's start by talking about the different types of stress. So the first one that we have is the tolerable stress. Keep going, CJ. Or positive or tolerable stress. So positive stress, that can be a good thing, such as meeting new people, the first day of school, performances or a competition, and with the caring support of adults or those around us, that can help prepare young brains and bodies for future challenges. Not all stress is bad. And then we move on to the tolerable stress. So an example of this is a death in the family. But if supportive adults work with the child to calm the stress and teach coping skills, they can moderate the stress so it will not be toxic or become that toxic stress or stay that toxic stress. And I have a personal example to share with you all. In May of this year, my husband passed away suddenly. And the kids and I came home and found him. And since then, we have been working through the grief journey. Now, at times it feels like it's toxic, like we can't get over this, it's going to be horrible and for the rest of our lives, right, with everything that comes each day. But as I know from my learning and also what I'm doing for myself and my kids, is that even though it's stressful, it's tolerable. We can keep putting one foot in the other, in front of the other, second by second each day. And by talking and sharing with each other, recognizing our feelings, and then deciding what we need to do, or even pre-planning. Like Thanksgiving, I didn't know how any of us were going to respond. So I did research before and had a plan in place. Thank goodness I did, because we woke up the morning of and we definitely needed that plan. So anticipation of what can come and pre-planning for any students to alleviate stress in teaching them those skills in advance is just as important as responding and supporting. And then we have toxic stress. So parental addiction, abuse, neglect tend to fall in this category because it's severe and ongoing. And if there's no supportive adults around to help that child calm and support them through that, developing those coping skills or implementing them, that's where we see the harm to our brain architecture. And it's very difficult and harder to undo when we live in that toxic stress. So again, when we recognize the trigger, we need to support that student even more. And there's no timeline for this. And like Steve and I were talking about recognizing our feelings, right? Recognizing that, okay, I'm starting to feel this way at work. My stress is going, I can feel my brain just kind of going away and taking longer to recover or taking longer to settle down at night. So then, okay, that's my own personal signal to take a step back and look at what I can do, little things I can do. And so like today I told Steve, I took 5 minutes to build a fire just to get up and get going. And because I felt my cognitive energy depleting. So it doesn't have to be where we're immediately having to fix things, but it's that ongoing recognition, self-awareness, and compassion for self that, you know what, I'm not at my best today, but I can do this to help myself. That's what we do for our students too. Okay. And then we have our window of stress tolerance. So if we think about toxic stress, I like to picture a window. And if we're regulated and secure, I live in the mountains, so it's easy for me to do. I open up the window. What are some things that I hear and feel and see when I open up that window? For me, I can hear the birds, I might hear the wind, the rustling through the trees, the grass. I can smell if rain is coming. I can look outside and see all of these things. But as I get stressed and that window starts to close, I can almost feel like I'm suffocating, or someone could feel like they're suffocating because you no longer hear, see, smell, notice the things around you. So when our students are experiencing toxic stress, or even sometimes tolerable stress, that window starts to close. And then that leads to that heightened cortical arousal, cortisone hormones in our bodies taking over, and the arousal of maybe big emotions, internal emotions, and that's where we see that fight, flight, freeze, or submit come into place. So we often can see our window, reflect upon, is our window open? Is it starting to close? If it's starting to close, is there something I can do to calm and re-regulate before that window just goes bam and it's closed and it's shut? Just another visual for you all to think about as you're working with your students. And then when we're experiencing stress, this starts in the cortex, kind of like what I said before. As it overloads, it moves to the parts of our brain. So if our survival brain is all the way to our shoulders, it's developed that far out. When we're calm and alert, we can think reasonably, rationally, we can pause and kind of problem solve. But as we get more stressed, it moves into our limbic system, and that's where our alarm comes in. And then our midbrain, that regulation of our emotions, starts to deplete and diminish, and we can become fearful. And then moving into our brain stem, terror. That window of tolerance is closed, it's shut, and it's going to take a minute or longer to get back to our rational and thinking brain. So recognizing that those who experience trauma, there may not even be a signal. It's just bam, right to the survival brain, right back to our brainstem, terror, and that terror can show up in different ways for different people. Okay. So now we're going to do another empowering ed lesson about coping skills. Keep going, CJ. So it's an activities. It's a scenario and discussion. We're not going to do a breakout room, but we are going to talk about this. So here's some things to consider. Why is it sometimes difficult for us to use our coping skills? Can anyone calm down for you? When have coping skills been useful for you? And can coping skills ever be harmful? Why or why not? Feel free to unmute or drop your response into the chat to any one or all of these questions. And as you're thinking and typing, Steve, what are your thoughts?
You know, this is such an important topic. And for me, you know, and kind of thinking about these questions and the prompts we have here, you know, oftentimes it is difficult to remember coping skills when you're in that moment, right? And that, you know, that response from stimulus to response, right? And if we don't, due to ACEs or due to, you know, past traumatic experiences, right, we don't have that buffer zone, right? So that space between stimulus and response is non-existent, right? And it takes practice to get to a place where you can, right, the stimulus happens, okay, what's my coping mechanism, right? What do I need to do right now to bring myself back to this logical place of thinking outside of my reptilian brain. And
Yep.
that takes practice, just like anything else. And for me, at least, it's come through repetition. It's uncomfortable because you can't always prepare for what that stimulus is going to be, right? And this is going back to triggers, right? Every individual has different triggers, whatever that may be. And so for me, that's kind of coming to this place where when I'm stimulated, what is my go-to coping mechanism, right? And again, just making sure that I'm in practice with that and that I'm aware, right? That just awareness of that I have educated myself, I have the knowledge, I have been taught, however you've come across in terms of learning that positive coping mechanism, right? That you do have that kind of empowerment, right? To be able to do that. And just to add to this, right? In terms of positive coping skills, right? For me, having a 2.5-year-old daughter, right? First time parent, almost 40 years old, like, talk about like coping skills, right? Like in terms in times of overwhelm or just kind of like the natural good stress that children bring to families, that is challenging, right? Because it is this understanding of how I speak and how I behave myself, right? Is important,
What
right?
you're modeling.
Yeah, modeling adult behaviors, right? And so, right, going back to this whole idea of that kind of adult behavior, right? If she sees me when I'm stressed, go and take a drink, or she sees me take a hit off of my vape pen, right? What is she learning, right? And so that's something I'm really kind of consistently aware of is when these challenges do present themselves is what is she seeing in terms of how I'm handling myself, right? And that's a good, when we have that understanding, and granted not everybody has that ability to do that, right? Just depending on your upbringing and where you're at in a lot, in terms of just a lot of things, right? And so for me, I feel very fortunate to have this knowledge, right? Knowledge is power, and to be able to implement that in kind of like my daily life practices, even in my personal life.
Right. And everyone in the chat says the same thing as you. Like, you got to practice it. If you're feeling overwhelmed, sometimes it's hard to rely on that. We have to think about that as our students, right? Through the lens of our students. Well, I told them to do this, but they didn't. I always go back to, do they know? And even, do they know how to do it? But even the step before that is, can they even recognize what they're feeling? And talking about modeling, going back to that a little bit, if we model for our students, they can learn that way too, whether it's good or bad behavior, like you said. And also the importance of modeling how we're feeling, sharing, right? Using that affirmative language to share. I'm feeling overwhelmed and frustrated right now because I spent all this time planning this beautiful lesson for you guys, and it feels like nobody's listening when you're blurting out and disrupting. So I need to take a moment. And you take that moment and then you can come back. That's modeling, that's communicating. If we model that by sharing what we're feeling, what we're going through, and recognizing it, we're also teaching coping skills. And then, yes, the self-harm is a negative coping strategy for sure. That can be harmful, as well as something else to remember. If you try to implement a coping strategy or force a student to pick something or do something when they're dysregulated, that's going to further dysregulate. So picking the timing, right? If they are not calm and in a place to even move forward, if they're still in that survival brain, that's not the time to offer a coping skill or even suggest one. Make sure they're regulated, make sure they have access because they may want that or need that. But it's important to also give them the space and time and grace to work through their emotions rather than feeling like, okay, I got to move on because I was told I have to pick something to make this stop. We also have to give time to regroup and the space to realize their feelings. That's just as important as teaching it and implementing it. Okay. So everyone, thank you. We're gonna have CJ drop a survey in here in the chat. You can also use your phone with the QR code, and you can use this to fill out. And like I said at the beginning, Completing this survey will then ensure that you get your certificate of completion, the recording, and again, the presentation link. And as you're doing that, CJ, you can go on to the next slide. Steve, CJ, and I want to leave you with a quote. So, and also open up for additional conversation and questions. So Noah Lyles, when he won his gold, said this: I have asthma, allergies, dyslexia, ADD, anxiety, and depression. But I will tell you that what you have does not define what you can become. Why not you? So if we've experienced trauma, if we've experienced stress, if we feel like we don't have compassion for ourselves, we can work through everything with support of community and support of each other. So we'll open it up for questions. On the next slide, you'll see in your presentation, we have ways to stay connected with us. Like CJ said, we have Empowering Education, our curriculum, and you can also log on to our Empowering Education website, and there's a lot of free resources for you, including the ones, and then also the ones that we presented in our presentation today. Through GSN, our work is to support you in your work, and we can partner with you to obtain grant funding or fund any type of opportunity you need for your students. It doesn't just have to be around trauma. We have instructional knowledge, behavior knowledge, and other supports available too. And here you can see, CJ, do you want to talk a little bit about our site? Oh,
Yes, sorry.
that's
Am I
okay.
on?
You can hear you now.
Yeah, so you'll see we have kind of two sites. Generation School Network is our parent site. That's where a lot of our coaching, our professional development, and our just services to school districts are offered. And then you can also find the link to the education, Empowering Education link. And that's where you're going to find more information about our curriculum. And so a lot of those come together. We do the curriculum, but we also add the coaching with the curriculum. So there's a lot of different packages that you can look at. We are very good at tailoring packages to your needs. So we don't really have set packages. We want to just help you the way you need help. So reach out to us and set up a meeting, and we're happy to kind of develop something for you.
And for those of you in the other states, we work across the country. You being someplace else doesn't exclude you from accessing our support and services too. We'll travel wherever we need to. We're even working in Alaska right now too. We've done Hawaii. We are willing and able and ready to serve you wherever you need support or would like support. And then also in the presentation, you'll have Steve and my email. Feel free to reach out anytime, even if you're not partnering with us through grants or anything. We're here to support you, give you additional resources. I had a counselor that attended last month who needed support with developing a suicide prevention training for staff. So jumped in and helped her and provided her with resources. We're here for you. And I'm gonna stick around for a bit. And if you have questions, feel free to ask. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.